Ladies and gentlemen who are joining us, just for the sake of clarity, I will take off my mask for a moment to introduce my distinguished panelists who joined the Rīga Conference, the debate on women, peace and security. And as a chair of Latvian Transatlantic Organization, I'm really very honored that we are having this discussion already second year in a row. And it looks that also in the next conferences we will continue this tradition and we'll talk about one of the most relevant issues in the global affairs, not only about the resolution 1325, which is definitely one of those founding cornerstones and also departure point, but if we look at the present world, then the world is very much dominated by different types of conflicts, and number of conflicts is only increasing. Unfortunately, also the Global Peace Index tells us the situation is degrading in that respect. And another point which I wanted to mention is that conflicts definitely influence lives and future of all members of society. But very often women become victims of those conflicts, and very often they also share the burden of daily lives. They have to take care of their children, of socializing of the family, and also they become a very decisive players in post-conflict reconstruction and also in building resilience. And as far as the narratives are concerned, then I think that majority of the UN nations agree that this is a serious problem. Otherwise, the UN Security Council's resolution 1325 wouldn't be adopted. But if we look at the real situation, what is happening on the ground, what is the situation in those conflict areas, then actually the resolution is a narrative, but it is not an effective tool of really building peace and stability. There are more efforts needed. And before the panel, I looked at some figures which are elaborated by the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum's report tells that if the same trajectory of development prevails, it will take 135 years to close the gender gap worldwide. 135 years. It will take 145 years to attain gender parity in politics. 267 years to close the gender gap in economic participation and opportunity. Not very comforting message, and this is one of the reasons why we are having this debate. We cannot wait 200 years. We have to do something right now. And therefore, indeed, I'm very honored to have today on our panel three very prominent speakers. And I will introduce shortly with them because their CVs are much longer than our time allows us to introduce. I will start with introducing His Excellency Kevin Rex, who is Canadian ambassador at Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And he has very long career of diplomat. He was advisor to the Prime Minister from 2004-2006. He was also acting director of the Canadian International Development Agency's Afghanistan Task Force from 2007-2008. Besides that, he was also engaged in International Trade Stabilization Reconstruction Task Force, responsible for civilian deployment, and also he served at Canada's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York, as well as in Kandahar, Afghanistan from 2006 to 2007. So indeed, so Ambassador, your long diplomatic career as well, your experience in Afghanistan will be very crucial for our discussion today. Then today we have with us Dr. Sarah Haroni. from Israel, and she is a lecturer at the Ben Gurion University at the Negev. I had a pleasure to be there. So, her areas of research are feminist security studies and United Nations Security Council's Resolution 1325 in Israel. And also she does a lot of studies on women's peace and security issues. She has a very long list of different publications in such distinguished journals as Politics and Gender, Social Politics, Security Dialogue, Cooperation and Conflict. And Sarah is also one of founding members of the Haifa Feminist Institute Feminist Center. Ambassador and Sarah is with us here in person. We have the third participant online, and it's my pleasure to introduce Lena Lastrika Mokrenchuk, and she is press officer, Operational Command North in Ukraine. Before the war, she was a teacher of history at school, a teacher of journalism at universities, and also she is a specialist in information warfare. And with the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, she had to leave everything and go to defend Ukraine. And at first she was a volunteer, and from August 2015, she is a serviceman in the 72nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, and she was also active participant on the Euromaidan. And she is also an experienced participant in operations in eastern Ukraine. And besides her career in army, she also is author of 4 books about Ukrainian-Russian war. Thank you very much, Lena, for joining us and being part of our discussion. And I would like to spin out our discussion with one question, which I will ask all of you. And how is the Resolution 1325 tackled in your countries? And probably I will start with you, Sarah, because it's subject of your research, and then we'll go to you, Mr. Ambassador, and then to Lena. Yeah, please.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to this very, very timely discussion. I want to start by sharing a memory that I have from, I think, 2002 or 2003, when I was a young activist living in Israel. That was before I did my PhD. And I was involved in women's issues and was getting more and more curious about the impact of the armed conflict, which then was the uprising, which is known as the Second Intifada, on the lives of Israeli women. And we heard about Resolution 1325, and we knew as local activists that the international community was starting to pay attention to women's situations. And we tried to find ways to link this abstract resolution, which it was a little bit before the internet was so prominent in our lives, so we had to rely on other sources of information. And we had to figure out, how do we make sense of these words, right, which were very declarative and very far away from us. And the first allies that we as young activists had were actually the Canadian ambassador in Israel.
It's a good start.
Yes, it's a good start. And it's an interesting start because we, as very local actors, did not have enough knowledge. We did not have international contacts. We did not have funding. And we also needed someone from another country, I think, to tell us that we are doing something right, that this is true, that our intuition that our voices matter is not just something that we are thinking about. And so an act of recognition was really needed in for us to start local projects that had to do with 1325. And the Canadian embassy, or the Canadian ambassador back then, tried to open some doors for us and to tell us, to bring people to speak to us, to encourage us to translate the resolution, right? So the first thing that women did in the first, I think, decade after the resolution was passed in the UN was this amazing translation project, translating the words into local languages. So women in different parts of the world could actually read the resolution in their own language and make sense of it. Now, the resolution we know today was only a starting point in a creation of a full-scale agenda, and this agenda has developed very much. It has developed within international organizations, but also on the ground with local actors like we were, trying to make sense of it in very local terms. So in Israel, since then, and I'm very interested in the way local politicians and local decision makers and local activists engage with this international norm, because I believe that while international organizations are important in creating standards and norms and expectations, it is local women who actually have to live through armed conflict, and they have to make sense of armed conflict. Whether they create local laws, like in Israel, there was a legal reform that basically mandates the participation of women in peace negotiations, or whether it is about the protection of women during armed conflict, or just raising awareness to what happens to different groups of women when there is an escalation, like in Israel, once in a while. So I think that these have been very, very important notions. Maybe we'll talk about this a little more later, but yes. 1325 really has a long history that is both global and local. And I think we need to pay attention to the very, very different interpretations and the very, very different ways in which women in different contexts engage with this new, I guess, normative language. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And indeed, you brought up already several very important issues. And the issue of how local communities meet international norms. Mm-hmm. Because very often it seems that this resolution is a normative document which demonstrates commitment, but then there are no ways how to reach the local communities. So probably later on you really could elaborate a little bit on that. Mr. Ambassador, so Canada is so well known about different issues related to human security. And women in conflict is also one of those Canadian very high-profile policy landscapes. So how in your country this resolution is tackled?
Well, first, thank you for having me here. It's nice to be back in the library. And I wanted to start with a bit of a caveat. I am joined in person and virtually, and with yourself as well, Professor, by actual, real, live experts on this. And I'm not. You know, I am, however, a firm believer. I've committed, you know, especially in this role, a lot of my resources and career to it. So I believe it and I committed it, but you know, I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm not an expert. And importantly, given what I look like and who I am, it's hard to be. And so I recognize the sort of position of real privilege that I come from. And my goal then is to be a friend and a supporter and aspire to be an ally, which I think is something you have to earn through consistent action. And that's certainly something that I've really committed myself to. But one thing I am pretty good at is bragging about what Canada does, which is the focus of your question. So this one at least is pretty straightforward for me. And as you pointed out, this has always been an important issue for Canada. So Canada had a seat on the UN Security Council in 2000, is obviously a non-permanent member, when 1325 was adopted. So we were one of the co-authors and co-sponsors of the original 1325. Then following its adoption, Canada co-founded and formed the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, which is still in action today, which has more than 60 of the missions in the United Nations. More recently, especially under our current government, the feminist foreign policy is sort of the anchor stone of everything that we do abroad. And that includes with our Ministry of Defense. It includes how embassies operate. And 1325, and then the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, and Canada adopted its second National Action Plan in 2017, are at the cornerstone of that. And so when we look at programming dollars, for example, when we look at really anything we do, we're doing it with through a lens of a gender-based analysis. It's mandatory training now for every Canadian diplomat abroad and programmers to go through gender-based analysis. I can tell you when I first joined the government, not only was it not mandatory, I mean, it had to be explained to what a lot of us was. This was not, gender analysis was not a key component of my university education when I was a student. So it's something that I learned through my professional career, thanks to the grace and, quite frankly, patience of some of the really superb and brilliant women that I worked with when I was at the aid agency. So Canada has you mentioned I used to work for it, but a peace and stabilization programming fund. It's about 100 million euros, and 95% of that has to be committed to initiatives that support the WPS initiative. More recently, Canada introduced our first ambassador for women, peace and security, Jackie O'Neill, and Jackie joined us here at this event last year virtually. We would have loved to have had her back because, unlike me, she really is an expert, and she's a much better speaker, and she's brilliant and charming, but difficult to fly from Canada these days. So, but she's been a great spokesperson for us, and we've had her involved in several activities, and we're really lucky to do that. We still co-chair with Uruguay the Women, Peace and Security Focal Point Network. Canada is one of the spearheaders of the Elise Initiative, and the idea behind that is I think a lot of what we're talking about in this session, and Professor, it's exactly what you mentioned, that it's great to talk about things at the United Nations or in forums like this. What actually is the substantive change is providing training and resources for women to serve as negotiators in conflict settings, to serve as soldiers, to serve in police peacekeeping missions, and those require resources and it requires training, and we're very happy to support that. And I think it's some of the other questions I can get into some more specific details about what we're doing. And then we also have to recognize as Canada, it's great that we're proud to speak about it, and your story about our ambassador in Israel is wonderful. I hope one day someone tells a nice story like that about me. But we have our own failings still as a country. You can't say that everyone back home is always behind this, so we have to work on our own education. We promote women in the military, which is important, and in police services, but our numbers are not fantastic either. Actually, Latvia's numbers are better, quite frankly. So we're on our second national action plan. We still have a lot of work to do, and we recognize that. And it's something that we look at with a very conscious lens now, I think, all the time.
Thank you very much indeed. Latvia, in very many respects, in terms of numbers, look very good, either in Army or Ministry of Defense, also in police, but it's a different story if it goes to gender equality from the perspective of how do you treat different issues, yeah? So it's like intertwined in everything what you are doing. And probably we sometimes assume that everything will happen anyway and not paying attention too much to that, but therefore it's a very important point which you made. And now I would like to turn floor to Lena, and how UN Resolution 1325 looks from Ukraine's perspective.
First and foremost, I would like to thank representatives of Canada and Israel, because we always feel your support in our fight dealing with what is happening now in Ukraine. Without your assistance, your support, it would be very difficult for us. When it comes to the role of women in the army, there are two aspects here. On the one hand, when military action started, the role of women has increased on the one hand, because there are no men and women in the army, there are just military persons, and you either fulfill your duties and you are thanked for that, and if you fail to fulfill your duties, you are demoted to a different position, no matter whether you're a man or a woman. And the other aspect mostly concerns interpersonal relations, because there are some men, military men, who cannot get accustomed to the fact and reconcile themselves with the fact that women are fighting together with them, and there might be some conflicts on the personal level. They may prevent women from growing and climbing the career ladder. But normally this conflict can be easily resolved. Another aspect to be mentioned here is that women often are not ready to assume the responsibility properly. They come to the army for a very different reason, just as men. Some come to the army to earn some money. Some would just like to find a job. And if a woman knows how to make food, she comes to the army to cook for the soldiers. Well, the same is quite characteristic of men, but those women who are really ready to perform very serious duties, they realize themselves in the army as well as they do in real life. My daughter, for example, was in the artillery and a commander, and she didn't have any obstacles. We had Lena, who had been a professor of physics and mathematics, and she became a very good commander of a mortar brigade, because her background enabled her to perform that duty at a very high level. So there are, how to put it in Russian, there are lots of, not specialities, maybe professions, which women can excel in as well as men, and not differ from men. And of course, there are things women are incapable of. Let it be repair of military equipment and military machines. So women will not be able to lift some heavy parts. So women are not used there. So it is not a question of gender. It's a question of your ability, whether you can perform the duty or not.
Thank you very much, Lena, and we will come back definitely to you with different questions related to situation in Ukraine, and particularly how women are contributing to post-conflict reconstruction, and I think that there could be also different women's capabilities which sometimes are even more useful than men capabilities. Thank you very much. But now I would like to ask Mr. Ambassador again. We talked about Resolution 1325 from your country's perspective, but looking at different publications and also different discussions taking place in that regard, there is a lot of criticism. The resolution was adopted 21 years ago. And if we look at conflict zones and also in those regions with high level of violence, the implementation of this resolution actually lags behind. So we cannot say that, yes, this resolution delivers. It probably delivers in terms of thinking. It organizes our mind, and also in some countries more advanced, it serves as some kind of a cornerstone. But what do you think? What are the main reasons why this resolution doesn't work as it was intended?
Well, I had, as you mentioned, the privilege of serving in the United Nations as a delegate for Canada. And when you're there for a long time, there's often a sense among delegates that you spend days and days haggling over commas and semicolons. And as a native English speaker, you often have an advantage where your colleagues say, how does this sound better? And you can try to manipulate the language. And we always talk about the UN doesn't really work in leaps and bounds, but it's a series of small progressive movements year over year over year. and maybe one year you just managed to move a comma, and the next year you managed to add one word. But when you add that up over 20 years, it does affect change. And you referenced 1325 as being a cornerstone. And I think that's a very good description for it. Because when you are a government or a politician or a minister or an activist or a representative of a non-governmental organization, it's very handy to have something that you can hang your proverbial hat on. And so a adopted UN General Assembly resolution is one of those. So it does that. It serves as the bedrock, the foundation on which you can build. And whether the build is getting it translated so that you can then use it to build your own organizations, or whether the build is then saying, well, then based on this as a foundation, we will we'll implement our own national action plans. And then those national action plans, because they're federal documents, have specific commitments that say, by 2026, we'll go from 14% women in the military to 25%, and we will spend $100 million trying to train so many women in activities related to peace building, to negotiation, to conflict resolution, and those are the piecemeal things. And you're all hanging your hat on that foundation of 1325. And then it's those subsequent activities that are meant to tackle the problem that you very rightly point out, that despite the resolution that's now 21 years old, we haven't fixed the world. But we haven't fixed the world in very, very many ways, and we recognize that now. And even the fact that we are talking about it, that we're having this conversation, that Latvia itself has adopted its first national action plan. I mean, this is all progress, but progress is slow and incremental, I should say, whether it's in combating COVID or whatever else. But I don't think we should punish or dismiss the foundation document that we have, and that we have been able to successfully build on it, but it is very, very much a work in progress. And the three of us being here and our colleague being there is just one small piece of that. And it's good to talk about it, but it's better to do things about it. And hopefully someone watching or some people in our audience have some inspired takeaways and start moving towards that. The fact that it's now a common theme at your conference is a small success as well.
Yeah. Ambassador, when you were serving in the UN and you were mingling around with different diplomats and the policy makers, is there really some kind of a common sense among UN diplomats that this is an important part of global affairs? Or still there are some countries which are, let's say, front runners and some are just considering that this is not an important issue? There is no huge difference in country perceptions on the role of resolution?
Massive difference in countries' perceptions of everything at the United Nations. So we don't all look at children the same way. We don't look at gender the same way. We don't look at norms around democracy, around media freedom, around anything. And this is why the UN exists. If all of the countries were on the same page, we wouldn't really need the organization, and we'd live in this wonderful sort of utopian society. And so the forum is one for conversation, but what you do come out with at the end is the majority of the states believe in this, and that's enough to push. And you see a transition over time. So 21 years ago, the number of countries that may have supported it, and I don't have that number off the top of my head, is, I am positive, much less than it would be 21 years later. So we are constantly moving that yardstick, but we don't move it by meters, we move it by centimeters. And so it's painful when you step back and say, well, it's been 21 years, we ought to have sorted it out. But yeah, it's a forum for debate and discussion, and we have that debate and discussion because we don't agree on a great number of things. Even amongst friends and allies, we often don't agree on a great number of things. But there we are. Better to talk about it than to fight about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I remember one of Latvian diplomats once stated that it's better 3 years to discuss rather to fight for one day. So in that respect, definitely it's true. But also it's a very encouraging message that number of countries who agree on the resolution is growing. And I think this is a very substantial issue, that they are not on the same note. And now I would like to ask a question to Sarai. When I was in Israel a year ago with several of my colleagues from Latvia, shortly before the pandemics, we were lucky enough 10 days after we were in a lockdown. We visited very many communities in Israel, And at least it was my impression that community life is very relevant. So probably in Latvia, we are not so much sticking to community life. We are more sticking to Riga life. But the locality plays a very substantial role. How active are women organizations on the ground and what roles they play? Because conflict is a constant feature of Israel's daily life.
This is a very good question. I think that one of the things that we've learned in the last 20 years is that context matters. And context is not only the kind of war, the type of warfare like we have in Ukraine. I think this is a war between two states, and it is a very high intensity conflict, where in Israel we have a protracted, long conflict. And so we have communities that have been living with or beside different kinds of warfare for quite a while. And for example, the Jewish towns outside Gaza who have been exposed to rocket attacks, I think for about 20 years, an ongoing exposure, and also Palestinians who live in the West Bank and in Gaza who experience within their daily lives the impact of ongoing conflict and military occupation and et cetera. So we actually know that this is an ongoing situation. And this means that in order to survive and in order to cope and in order to resist and create alternatives or alternative visions towards peace, we cannot just rely on formal politics or on the government, right? So communities to survive in such a situation have to find a lot of sources of power. And so, for example, we see within the communities themselves. For example, I've done research, ethnographic research, outside the Gaza Strip. And we found these close networks of women who work together every time there is a crisis, an escalation, a rocket attack. These women have a very clear network. They share their duties, they go out and help each other, they search the town, they know exactly whose house has been hurt, and they have learned how to cope. And these women really form a very, very important part in what we call the resilience of these communities. And this is something that's sometimes unnoticed because it is, women's work. So sometimes we don't even think about what they do as security or as something that is so essential for survival, but it is. And another kind of activity that sometimes is overlooked is women's activism, political activism, social activism, grassroots movements. And in Israel, because of the ongoing conflict, it is hard to be a peace activist. And many people don't believe that a solution to this conflict is possible. And so women who are also peace activists have to work very hard to get noticed. And they have to really find ways to, whether it is by protest or by creating dialogue or by working on policy issues or by petitioning the courts. These women have to be very, very creative and also very strong emotionally and collectively. So we are seeing that the impact of the conflict goes always. Women are not these passive victims, right? They have to find ways to cope, to organize. And so while we do see this pattern in other places, every place is different. So I think I can stop at this.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually here is a question which we will tackle a little bit later, exactly related to that issue. But I wanted to ask a question to Lena. You heard right now Sarai's explanation of situation on the ground, that women are very active on community level. And Lena, are there women organizations in Ukraine dealing with peace and security issues, particularly on the ground in eastern Ukraine? So, and how those organizations are linked to community members? What kind of job do they do on the ground?
By community, you understand our villages or small rural parishes, right?
Yes.
So we have slightly different situation. I have visited Israel many times, and I know the way of life of that men and women are operating and acting separately, but historically, it has been occurred that women and men had equal rights and duties, especially in Transnistria, especially when our guys were digging the trench and came and identified and detected very ancient burial that has been a girl, a young woman who had protecting and defending her native country, and it has been a really grave made for her. And those coming to us, they are saying that that has been very strong woman and women. We have not distinction on separation between duties for men or for women. If something must be done, these are men and women, but regarding the rights, that depends on the situation. As regards peacekeeping or organization of peace and security and civic organizations, so we have organizations dealing with some specific and particular issues, but one of the brightest examples is volunteering organizations. So when everything is very peaceful, everybody goes and does whatever he or she needs to do. But when our nation is endangered, or our children, as a situation when our children were beaten up during Euromaidan, and then all and every man and woman of Ukraine stood up and defended our children, irrespective of the gender, whether that was a man or a woman. Everybody was really installing tents, the trenches, the obstacles, etc. So we didn't pay attention whether that human was man or woman. And I had subordinate drivers who came, assisted for some time, and then left. So I also have done much. And we also brought the protective vests, irrespective of gender separations. Regarding the protection and defense on international level, these are Irina Mirashenko and Pyotr Poroshenko, or any other politician who has been successful in those processes. I would not say that we have some distinct and very demonstrative distinction or separation. In terms of gender equality, we might women should feel themselves more as politicians. That, of course, means some additional pressure, as not paying so much attention for family or children. And women must really do both. And so a woman, as a politician, must protect and defend all the issues which are pertaining to the country and to her family. For instance, these are practical issues like mother, for instance, is working by 6 p.m. and there is no place for children to stay after school before they go home. And I think that the situation has really improved for better because there is no choice for women to be made to raise children or to go in politics or to be active in the community.
Thank you, Elena. When we were discussing women, peace and security issue from perspective of effectiveness, from perspective of implementing this resolution on the ground, there was always one question actually pending, and it derives from criticism of implementation of this policy, but also from the perspective of effectiveness. And I probably would like to ask this question to Sarah, because you are also doing research on this issue. It's much easier to evaluate, or at least to present state of affairs, if you have certain criteria, at least a few indicators, which you can apply as a measurement and saying, oh, like Ambassador said, there were less countries supporting, now there are more. So what would be your, as researchers, proposal? What should be those indicators telling that, yes, situation is improving or situation is worsening?
I think this is a great question. So implementation, we have today a certain dogma, I think, of what is the best, what are the best practices in implementing the WPS agenda. And I think, for example, national action plans are seen as a very good policy mechanism or a policy tool where countries, on the one side, they actually say that they accept these global norms and they want to address them, but they also have enough freedom to find their own foci, right? Their own issues, their own ways to interpret the resolutions. So that would be a good benchmark if whether or not a country actually adopts a national action plan. Now, Israel does not have a national action plan on 1325. And this is a very interesting question for me as a researcher. I ask, why is that, right? How come this country, which has quite high levels of gender equality, which is a democracy, which does comply with various international norms and conventions that deal with women's rights, and has a very strong tradition of adopting international norms in terms of women's rights, why does Israel not have a national action plan? And there's no clear answer. I think some of it has to do with domestic politics and the certain ways in which Israel responds to security norms. So there's a question about sovereignty here, whether states have their own way of localizing these norms, and whether national action plans are actually a good benchmark. So, okay, so Israel does not have. Now let's look at another option. What if we take, for example, international negotiations, right? Let's see whether Israel incorporates women in international negotiations, in peace agreements, okay? Now, we had the Oslo peace agreements in the 1990s. Those were very extensive agreements with the PLO and later with Jordan, and some negotiations with Syria that never really came through to a peace agreement. And since then, we really didn't see much of negotiations with neighboring countries. But in the last year, we have seen a very, very important political change when Israel basically had a series of agreements with countries in the Gulf region, the Emirate regions, Bahrain, etc. And this is a very dramatic, I think, move in terms of becoming more invested in the region. And I really think this is important. And I think that Israel has to change the way its status within the Middle East. But did we have more women in these negotiations? Well, the answer is no. We actually didn't make much progress since the 1990s in terms of the numeric representation of women in these negotiations, and also in terms of language, because these agreements have been titled the Abraham Accords. Now, this name, even the name Abraham Accords has a gendered twist to it, right? And one can ask, well, why not the Abraham and Sarah and Hagar Accords, which are these symbols of religious histories? And I think the answer is, well, clearly there were no women at the table, and that is why this language is so gendered. So I think we really have to pay attention to processes and to say, well, why is this happening? Why does this seem so normal after 20 years here? Yeah, these are serious questions, very serious.
Thank you very much. But it's interesting that measurements which you mentioned, at least the first one, regarding action plans, it would be some kind of general acceptable to almost all countries. But when it comes to peace negotiations, like for instance, in Latvia's case or in Canada's case, we were not engaged in peace negotiations. However, it's a very important issue. And by the way, it's very much criticized that actually over hundreds of years, you could hardly see a single woman whatever peace negotiations were taking place. But still, yeah, I think it's something what those who are doing WPS have to think more about. So how to elaborate.
And I want to add something. I want to add something, that there is a paradox. Because on the one hand, it seems that things don't change. As if, we don't have, in Israel, we don't have a national plan, or women are not negotiators. But at the same time, we have a very strong civil society movement. We have very strong women's organizations. We have more and more women in the diplomatic corps or in the foreign ministry and in security. Women serve in the Israeli army, right? And we have more and more women integrated into peace and security. So these are paradoxes. And sometimes we cannot really understand the full picture and the possibilities at a given moment. Maybe in the next decade, we will see more women in Israeli negotiation teams. It's just a question of timing or ripeness or just demanding that they are there. And I think persistence here is very important. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of resources and will, political will, to move these things, especially in places where we actually need this, like Israel, like the Ukraine, and the Baltic region, which by itself has different, security issues.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to ask Lena a short question because before we move forward, Lena, are there any influential women organizations in eastern Ukraine who participate in stabilization in the region?
I would like to address the preceding question concerning quantitative indicators. Let us take our Ukrainian army before the war of 2013 and now. Now we have 35% of women, unlike the previous situation where there were about 9% of women. Presently, our women hold higher posts, including commander posts. Now, for example, the commander of medical forces is also a woman. And in our political corps, there are lots of women. As far as women's NGOs are concerned, who are participating in the stabilization post-conflict, I don't know such influential organizations of women for one reason. We didn't used to have a need in purely female organizations. We normally have integrated organizations of both men and women. When it comes to the organizations helping to stabilize the situation in Donbass, we lack them. There should be many more of such organizations. What hampers the process? What prevents civil population from coming there and setting up such organizations? Just as in cases described by Sarah, the people have already been so tired of war that they don't want to listen any military narrative. And we need to attract more women to get them involved, maybe set up some unions of mothers or women of Donbass to address the issues which are typical, characteristic for those regions and not characteristic of the country at large.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leda. And now I will turn floor to the attention of panelists to the questions asked here via internet. And the first question is, does the Women, Peace and Security agenda have common areas of collaboration in spite of different stance, opinions or on gender politics? So that's what we discussed before. We discussed what is happening in Canada, in Israel and Ukraine. But so what is a common ground? So who would start? You, Ambassador, or Sarah?
The professor of...
Professors always have to be first.
So I think this is a good question. To understand I guess the collaborations or the common issues, we have to understand the conflicts. We have to understand what are the differences, right? And what are the issues where countries disagree. And I think that the term gender by itself and the references to the protection of women in armed conflict is something that not all countries agree upon. And I think that in some places we will find competing interpretations of what does it mean to protect civilians. Why do we need to protect civilians? Who are civilians who should be protected? And I think this has to do with the interpretation of international law and the interpretation of the Geneva Conventions. So while certain countries have a clear stance that all civilians should be protected during armed conflict or hostilities, countries that are involved in armed conflict find this very difficult to accept, or I guess to actually do this. And I think for Israel, which is basically a much stronger force vis-a-vis Palestinians, for example, this is a very clear dilemma. Who is responsible for the well-being, for example, of Palestinian women and girls, right? Is it the Palestinian Authority or is it the Israeli military? And these are deeply political issues. It's not only about humanitarian concerns. It's about politics. And I think that we really have to flesh out these disagreements and to understand what are common areas. And I think that most of us would agree, and many countries agree, that, for example, fighting sexual violence or sexualized violence during armed conflict is a very, very high issue on the agenda. Ensuring women's freedom from different sorts of violence, really taking care that women have access to basic services, to water, to childcare, to health services. And I think these issues are still in the core of the WPS agenda. But we always need to remind ourselves and others that it is about lives, women's lives and well-being, and their children's lives and well-being.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree entirely. The answer to the question, though, is just yes. right? The WPS agenda is based on a common framework, and to use your word, it's the cornerstone document, which, to just reiterate, Professor, what you said, so it says, women are underrepresented in the peace process and are unfairly impacted in numbers that the men fighting can't even fathom in the conflict, and so that needs to be fixed. Now, how each country then does it, which is the second half of the question, is different. So the 5 elements of Canada's National Action Plan, for example, are not the same as the 5 elements of the Latvian National Action Plan. And if Israel had a National Action Plan, one of ours, for example, is to increase the participation of women in the armed forces. I don't think that would need to be one in Israel, quite frankly. So we take the foundation, and then you focus on where you are in that linear progression, and then what you can do. Canada is very privileged in our geographic location, in the peace and stability that we enjoy, which is largely a privilege of our geographic location, 3 oceans and rather large neighbors to the south, and we're comparatively wealthy. So our obligation then is to take our experience and our peace and our wealth and share it in a way that we can't expect some other countries to be able to do. So those are the variations, but the theme is absolutely the same, and there's no disagreement on the foundational theme of the WPS and 1325.
Elena, I wanted also to ask you a question which derives from Sarah's previous comments that in Israel's implementation of UN's resolution 1325, at the very beginning, big role was played by international partners. And philosophy of WPS was to very large extent brought by cooperative efforts between Israel and international partners. When you in Army are dealing with international partners, and Ukraine is very good at cooperating with different countries in military field, is the gender issue also part of your collaborative agenda?
Here, I have to thank Sarah for having paid attention to that aspect of fighting sexual violence during military conflicts and who has to deal with helping the civil population, because the fighting army physically is incapable, often incapable of helping the civilian population. We're trying our best, but our best is not enough to secure the situation of the civil population. That is why we need support of international organizations in this field, OECD and other organizations coming, the Red Cross, which cater to the needs of the civil population in food, water, because there are several settlements within the conflict zone or which are located in so-called gray zone. People there can't buy bread, can't buy clothes, and they are in great need of help and support. And of course, such kind of collaboration is being carried out. And on the other hand, we'll need Israeli experience of how to cater to the needs of people in conflict zones. And here, as it seems to me, the role of women wouldn't be overestimated, because women, if such organizations are set up, would be able to take care of the civil population. And there should also be half military male organizations that would collaborate with women's organizations, helping them, protecting them, because as you know, we still are exposed to shootings of the civil population, some 6 kilometers from the line of front, the Russian side would bomb residential buildings. People would remain homeless without anything. So we need to help not only those who are in the so-called gray zone, too close to the conflict zone, but we also need to pressurize the Russian side, because the war, as we see it, as we, the military, see it, that we shouldn't affect the civil population. The civil population shouldn't suffer. And in this, we really need help and assistance of international organizations.
Yeah. Yes, Ambassador.
If you don't mind, if I can just follow up, but I think you were asking as well about international cooperation, and Canada is exceptionally proud of our cooperation in Ukraine. Latvia is home to the largest standing military presence anywhere in the world, but the second largest one is actually in Ukraine, and it's the largest permanent foreign presence. It's a training team. The last commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lake, one of the first female commanders of it. But in contributing to the Ukrainian armed forces through training, operational stuff, and I think it's 50 million euros to date, a big focus of that has been on targeting some of the areas. I mentioned at the beginning that when we do programming, we look at it through a gender-based analysis lens or through a WPS lens. So a lot of that programming has gone towards building up the percentage of women serving in the forces or in the police force. Canada has police trainers there as well. And then the focus there is, what my two colleagues were talking about, is raising awareness on how to properly tackle gender-based assault from a police officer's perspective. So it's a friend and a partner supporting our allies, but doing some of that support really through this lens of WPS anchored in our own national action plan.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I also wanted a little bit to touch upon women's issue in Afghanistan. So because this is one of those very hot spots which we are now watching from TV screens and internet screens, not being able to be present there and to assist at the present moment. And I wanted to ask Ambassador Rex, since you also have your experience in Afghanistan, and indeed one of those social life areas where substantial improvements were visible despite different weaknesses in the country, despite different problems in the country. It was definitely improvement of the situation of women there. And recently I was watching news, and there was one journalist from Herat who was giving an interview and sharing her everyday life concerns about her physical life, about her career. And myself, I was remembering at that moment meeting the first prosecutor in Afghanistan, female prosecutor from Herat. And they were very proud that this city became some kind of a flagship in progress in women's rights. Yeah. What we can do at the present moment from outside.
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd be in some very, very important job. I mean, I don't know what we can do from outside. Sorry, you started with a story, so let me tell you one of my own. I was deployed in 2006. This doesn't seem like a very long time ago in my mind, but I suppose it is. And I recall being struck, so I was at the time a development advisor. My job was to work with the Canadian military on development programming. And I was invited to the governor, so we were in Kandahar in the south. I was invited to the governor's New Year's Eve party. And it was 5,000 people or something, huge, huge, huge event. And we go there in a military convoy and get out, and it's meant to be quite festive. But certainly I was very quickly struck by the fact that at this celebration of some 5,000 people, the influencers and the leaders and the tribal elders and the people affecting change, there was one woman there. And she was the Canadian captain who was our convoy leader. And that was it. So this entire event, and you thought to yourself, all of the efforts that we're trying to put in, and how do you affect effective change for more than half of the population when you can't even interact with them? And so fast forward then to the last few years, and things really did change and they really did improve. And I think that's what's important to remember. I was there, my deputy at the embassy just came from a 2-year tour in Kabul. Many of the Canadian Armed Forces members here served there. And we left a lot of behind, including some of our friends. And so you look at that experience and wonder, what happened? But you mentioned, education. Under the Taliban, there were no girls in school. And while we were there, we were, working with the community and with the ministries to build schools, but also ensuring that women girls in this case, had a chance for education. And there is an entire generation of women that got to go from kindergarten through to university that would not have had that. And that has to, I have to believe, that has to shift the dynamics of what this country is now. And I don't know what that will be, but it absolutely has to. But some of the other success stories, so the embassy was involved, Afghanistan actually does have a national action plan on women, peace and security, 2017 to 2022. Probably it's not being so strictly implemented by the current regime, but it had one. Canada at our embassy had a Friends of a WPS working group where they were investing in training women negotiators. Some of those negotiators ended up being the very people in Russia and Qatar who were negotiating with the Taliban. We're very proud of Deborah Lyon, who's a former Canadian ambassador who now represents the United Nations there, who is sitting around the table, who stayed behind when everyone else was closing down embassies. So there was change, there was improvement. What it looks like going forward, I don't know. It's a challenge. It's sad for those of us who are there. It really is. But you have to believe that we helped an entire generation, and that I think that has to count for something.
Ambassador, when I asked this question, I was not thinking that you have a crystal ball and you will provide us with a clear action plan. But I was asking this question mostly about those countries which were assisting Afghanistan to pursue their peaceful, or let's say post-conflict reconstruction period. And now we are facing quite uncomfortable situation. So in order to sustain the level which was achieved, assistance has to be continued. But how to assist under Taliban regime if they do not respect women's rights?
Well, and that's the very debate that's happening. In fact, none of our governments have recognized the Taliban regime. So how do you even negotiate with a regime that you don't recognize as a legitimate government? There is a legitimate government in exile, and this is something that the Baltic states can certainly relate to too. So is it temporary? Does it last forever? Do they modify their behavior in a way that allows for international cooperation? These are the questions that the experts who are working largely in Doha are tackling. And we will, I guess we'll have to see. Certainly, we've heard public pronouncements that it will change, but the reality on the ground doesn't seem to indicate that that's the case so far.
Exactly. Okay, now we are moving our debate further on, and here is another question, which unfortunately I cannot read because of light. Ambassador, could you please?
Sure. I feel like I'm on Jeopardy. For 10 points. Are post-conflict areas also a, quote, crisis that shouldn't be wasted for the WPS agenda, or do they regress any WPS efforts?
Okay, who is going to take this question? Sarah?
I think I hope I understand the question. So I want to talk about post-conflict and what do we know about post-conflict? And the post-conflict is a very, very strange situation because nobody really knows. Some conflicts, they end, but many conflicts they just peter out or they just transform. And so when do we start actually counting the post-conflict period? When does it begin and when does it end? Some conflicts, we can ask whether South Africa is beyond the post-conflict, or whether Northern Ireland has overcome the post-conflict period, or Bosnia Herzegovina, right? So I think these are valid questions because each generation that is born into post-conflict has to resettle and reconcile the legacies of violent events. So I think post-conflict, in terms of women's memory, for example, is a very, very important stage. And I just want to say something very specific about this. For example, we know that sexual violence in war is a taboo issue. And sometimes women start telling histories or their personal stories of sexual violence only like decades after a conflict has ended. We know this because women, only in the 1980s or 1990s, women all over the world started to tell their personal stories from World War II. Sometimes it really takes decades. And so for these women, I don't know if the conflict has ended in many senses, right? And so this is something we have to think about when we think about post-conflict, and when we think about healing, and when we think about transitioning into a different future. And so I think that, yes, WPS is very relevant for decades after conflicts end. It could serve as an opening point for justice, for communication, for cooperation, for solidarity and assistance. And I think that we should really learn how to listen to the stories of civilians who have been part of very violent conflicts to understand the real damage that war can create for generations. And so, yes, I think this is a very, very valid question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lena, I wanted to ask you, what about governments' attitude towards different activities on the community level? Is the government, national government, really aware what is happening on the ground in different communities, as you said, villages, in those conflict areas? What kind of relations have been built between those two entities?
I think that there is no significant role of the national government. So I think that the government has not been so interested, whether as that has been really laid as a burden on the shoulders of volunteers or non-governmental organizations, as they now are aware of what happens locally, or for the discretion of international organizations such as UNICEF or other international organizations. But the problem actually is much deeper, and the government should pay much more attention to the villages. These are, first of all, distant, there is no job, and people are really surviving on social benefits or allowances, or that they are producing something and are selling that. If there have been reintegration programs on specific territories in terms of requalification of women, for instance, and enabling them to earn for survival. In 2014-15, we had the experience of, I do not remember correctly whether that was Latvia or Lithuania, we had a very acute phase of the conflict, and therefore I'm sorry I do not remember exactly. We had a joint project, so people were producing their crafts, so socks knitted or tables, and they were sold in Europe. That is what those regions actually need. Opportunity not only and not to train them to receive allowances and survive on that, but really enable, empower them of sewing, making dresses, clothing, and then producing, really producing, and then providing an opportunity to distribute that. The second aspect I would like to pay attention to are children. Here, children, if they have schools in vicinity, they are attending schools, but there are free schools in one vicinity, more or less away of the conflict, but one is in the area of or distance or radius of the conflict. And the children, if there is fight or some air attack, children are hiding in the basement. But that would be permit for soldiers, for the military to move the front line somewhere else, away from the school, so the children could really go to school and survive. And when the front line was moved, for instance, in specific certain villages, people were not afraid to go outside, at least. And while all the negotiation of a moving front line or the opinion of military should be taken into consideration, as sometimes it happens that the point where from our army should be retracted, we do not provide an opportunity. Of course, we can move 100 meters away and the shooting will restart, but for that would not be. I would like so that the government would pay attention to the reintegration programs for those regions and for those areas and villages, so that a population of temporary occupied territories would enter the schools and universities without entrance examination, and a woman, so that they could come to study irrespective of their age, and they could also learn and acquire some new occupation. And children, what about children? Why children are from temporarily occupied territories can come and study without examination, and why children from frontline villages which are currently under shooting are not able to do so and are not allowed to do so. And that is a decision of the government, where is no military or any other activity of NGOs could really provide that decision. And this is our government to make such decisions. And while we are in the area of conflict, we are dealing more with practical issues, so to say. And I am currently located in a very small room because I'm in North Donetsk, and the conflict is slightly away, but still we are almost on the front line. And these are and government is located in more safe place so that to make such decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. And indeed, you touched upon, from my point of view, two very, very important issues. And one is that your characteristic of relations between government and local community indicates, I think, a very vital problem, not only in conflict areas, but in principle as such. Local communities, they only know what exactly do they need. While unfortunately, if there are no sustainable and solid relations between the national government, in the end, it doesn't work. Yeah, it doesn't work. And another very important point, I think, it's about empowering local communities and organizations which are functioning on the ground. And this is, on the one hand, privilege of international involvement because there are special programs and special techniques how to do that. But this international support doesn't last forever. So there should be some kind of sustainability in this empowerment efforts. And that's what I was asking a question about Afghanistan. It's exactly the question about how to continue empowering, because particularly weak communities which are constantly involved in the conflict, they have very limited resources and also knowledge how to proceed with those empowerment efforts. And this probably is one of those issues which has to be tackled very seriously on international level when we were debating what we should do more. And it would be indeed this, from my perspective at least, empowerment of women's organization on local level. Because here is the strength. So this is the resource for women, but not only for women, but via women, children, education, and very often healthcare as well. So it's a very wide variety of different efforts. And Sarah, how it's in your country, this difficult type of relationship?
I totally agree, and this is something that we know, that assisting local women's groups with the projects of their choice. So believing them that what they ask for is really what they need, helping them create resources and infrastructures, whether it is in the field of education or in domestic violence or in real political work of creating coalitions or creating documents or really documenting issues. I think that's a very, very safe policy, because when we invest, and I say, I use the word invest, but I really think that when we promote and aid and support local women's groups, we actually get, we really help various segments within societies. And this, I think, has proven, this is really something that we have seen in the last 20 years. Around 1325, that local women know how to use funding and they know what to do. And so, and I think that this is a very positive aspect of implementing 1325 around the world, really working in solidarity, listening to women, supporting their needs, and accepting that what they ask for is really what they need. So this is an important component.
Ambassador?
So I was thinking back to Afghanistan, and I won't embarrass any other countries out there. Maybe I can embarrass my own. That's okay. But we used to say that Afghanistan the landscape was filled with failed development projects, and because when your organization gives you lots of money to spend, and they want pictures and they want something flashy, it's very easy to build something. And frequently what happened, not just there, but all over the world, over the past many, many years, were projects that were designed and implemented by the donor nation, not by the receiving nation, with limited consultation with the host nation, with community organizations. And so if you don't feel that you're a part of that, then when it breaks down or fails, then it becomes that country's bridge or that country's road or that country's tractor, which, by the way, we never had spare parts for here. So it worked for 6 months and now it sits down. And so exactly the investment in community organizations, in education and schooling for boys and girls, for men and women, is lasting and is sustainable. The problem with it from the host nation perspective is it's being implemented by a government that may only be in power for 4 years. And they want to say to their voters, who, by the way, are the taxpayers paying for it, look what we've accomplished. And the first minister I worked with in Kandahar was Minister Zia, who was a brilliant man. And when we talked about all the work we had to do, he said very wisely, so we don't have any engineers here. And it will take me 20 years to grow a new engineer. And you can't fast track that. They have to learn to read and write, and then they have to learn problem skills and mathematics, and then they have to go to university. So 20 years. And most donor nations, most donor nation governments, I should say, I think the people are different, don't really think in 20-year-long timescales. But to be sustainable and have the long-term impact that you're talking about and how that continues, that's what you needed to do. So we, the international community, had some successes in Afghanistan and other places, but we had a lot of failures too. And the Auditor General of some of our countries have pointed out some of those, those very, very expensive failures. But investing in people, in education, in boys and girls, women and men, that's the long-term sustainability. And so now the question is, we've done that. We've had some successes. There are some brilliant young women that are successfully graduated from university that are expert negotiators, that are expert engineers. And is there a place for them, and what can we as the international community do to find a place for them? And that's very challenging when you barely have a dialogue with the regime that's currently controlling the government. And that's what I think will be hard for all of us to wrap our minds around. Because if we just take them all in, then that's fine for our countries, because they become valuable contributors, right? President Vike Freiberga was a fantastic contributor to the University of Toronto, but she was also a pretty good president of Latvia. So we have to find a way where we don't just take the best and brightest, but we're able to support them. And it's difficult when you're not on the ground, and we're not on the ground anymore.
Yeah, thank you. We are very quickly running out of time, unfortunately. I think we could continue for a very long time. But I wanted to ask each of you one very short question, and a very short answer. If you would be, for 5 minutes, in shoes of Secretary General of the United Nations, what would be your one decision on women, peace and security which you would like to implement? Sarah. And then Ambassador, and then Lena.
Yeah, well, I think it's time for a world conference on women, UN World Conference on women's rights. This is what I think I would do. I would just call a global conference, a UN-sponsored conference. We haven't had a conference since 1995, and I think it is about time to do that.
Thank you. Ambassador?
As a newly appointed Secretary General, I support my colleague's initiative, and I'm happy to second it.
You have been diplomat for too long. Okay, Lena, what would be your take?
First of all, I would like to respond to His Excellency that you would be able to take everybody in. Well, you don't need to do that. We want to live in our country. We want to make it flourish. We want our population to be happy, although it is wonderful in your country. If I were a UN General Secretary, I would first and foremost ask the global community to pay attention to women in conflict zones, so that women have more opportunities to realize themselves politically, exercising influence upon their respective societies. And for that, we need to think of how to balance bringing up children and career. So I also support previous speakers. So let us convene at the UN level and discuss women's issues.
Thank you very much, Elena. And indeed, I'm very happy with today's discussion because so wonderful speakers. And I'm really admiring how you all three managed to cover global issues, national issues, and also local issues. And therefore, I think this debate was very fruitful for politicians if they were watching, also for activists and those who are dealing with WPS on daily level. On this positive note, I really would like to thank our panelists, those who were following us on internet and also were thinking about their role as UN Secretary General and their contribution. And I really would like to hope that next year, again during Rīga Conference, we will have as lively debate as today, and we will have as many practical recommendations and ideas which we had today. So thank you very much. Thank you, and see you next year.